Rise of the Phoenix. Daniel no longer counted the days since he'd lost everything. Instead, he marked the days he'd earned back a little piece of himself. The blog became his outlet, but also his platform. By the end of the year, it had over 10,000 subscribers. His inbox was full of people asking for advice. Some lost their jobs, others were going through divorces or struggling with mental health. Daniel replied with honesty. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. What he had was his story and the certainty that rock bottom could be a foundation, not a grave. When a mid-sized company in Detroit reached out, asking if he'd speak at their internal wellness conference, Daniel almost turned it down. Who was he to give a talk on resilience? But the HR director said, "Your blog post made one of our employees decide not to quit, literally and figuratively. We need your voice." So he went. Nervous, sweating through a secondhand suit, he stood in front of 80 strangers and told them the truth. He didn't sugarcoat the nights he'd cried alone in a shelter, or the humiliation of selling his watch to buy groceries. He told them that resilience wasn't something you found. It was something you built, one uncomfortable step at a time. He got a standing ovation. Soon, more speaking requests followed. A podcast invited him to share his journey. A recovery clinic asked him to lead a workshop. A local college brought him in to talk to students about failure and grit. Everywhere he went, someone would pull him aside after and whisper, "I needed to hear that." He began structuring his talks into something more concrete, a framework for rebuilding after collapse. He called it the grit curve. The idea was simple. When life bends you, your growth is in the curve, not before or after it. That concept resonated deeply. What started as a blog post became a talk, and eventually, a self-published book. He titled it Unstoppable: The Rise from Rock Bottom. It didn't become a bestseller overnight, but it found its way into the hands of people who needed it most. A woman in Arizona said it helped her leave an abusive marriage. A teenager in Ohio wrote to say it kept him from attempting suicide. These letters reminded Daniel of something Viktor Frankl had written, that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. Daniel's life was no longer about reclaiming the past. It was about building forward. He took a leap and founded the Phoenix Project, a nonprofit dedicated to helping people rebuild after life-altering losses. Its mission was simple: provide free resources, mentorship, and practical training for those trying to start over. With a team of volunteers, many of them people who'd written to him, he created an online curriculum called From Ground Zero, focused on financial literacy, emotional resilience, and career reentry. It took off, not virally, but steadily, like roots spreading underground. A local news segment brought in donors. Grants followed. Soon, there were real offices. Then, small satellite branches in other cities. Daniel insisted on one thing. Every mentor in the program had to be someone who'd hit their own rock bottom. It wasn't just about experience, it was about empathy. By the third year, Daniel found himself speaking at a TEDx event, walking onto the red dot in a crisp navy suit, his old shelter boots now replaced by polished leather ones. But he kept those original boots in his closet. He never wanted to forget where he came from. The talk went viral. Overnight, his inbox exploded. People from all over the world, Thailand, Brazil, Iceland, wrote to say they'd hit their bottom, but now they had hope. Daniel realized this wasn't just a personal journey anymore. It was a movement. Publishers began calling. Major ones. He signed a deal and expanded his book with new stories, stories of others who'd rebuilt their lives. He called it The Fire Within, and when it hit shelves, it climbed to the top 10 nonfiction list in 2 weeks. But success didn't change Daniel the way you might expect. He didn't buy a penthouse or flash his story on every talk show. Instead, he reinvested into the Phoenix Project. He opened a scholarship program for single parents returning to school. He created a mobile app that connected people in crisis to emergency resources. He partnered with employers willing to give second chances to those with gaps on their resumes or criminal records. Daniel's days were full now, but not of noise or ego. They were full of purpose. He was a man who had learned how to rise, and more importantly, how to help others rise with him. And yet, some nights, when the city lights blurred through his apartment window, he'd sit quietly with a cup of coffee and remember the cold floors of the shelter, the sting of rejection, the emptiness of a future that once seemed erased. He didn't dwell on it. He carried it, like a scar, not to hide, but to honor. Because the truth was, Rock bottom had given him something success never could: clarity. It stripped away illusion. It showed him what mattered. It taught him that people are stronger than they know, and that resilience isn't loud. It's often quiet. It's the decision to get up. Again, and again, and again. Daniel Hayes had once been broken. Now, he was unstoppable, not because he avoided failure, but because he had learned to rise from it. Years later, Daniel found himself standing alone on a beach in Oregon, a place he'd visited only once before, during a college trip, long before life had tested him. The waves thundered in slow rhythm. The air tasted like salt and wind and something ancient. He had just come from a Phoenix Project conference in Portland, where over 1,000 attendees gathered to share stories of transformation. There had been a woman who escaped a trafficking ring, now mentoring teens in her community. A veteran who had attempted suicide but now ran group therapy for PTSD survivors. A former inmate who had earned a law degree, fighting wrongful convictions. All of them had walked through their own darkness. All of them had built a new light. Daniel hadn't spoken at this one. He had chosen to listen. He stood in the back, in quiet awe, as others told their stories. Stories that had started with loss, failure, addiction, incarceration, grief. What tied them together wasn't just recovery, but resilience. A resilience that didn't pretend things were easy, but that refused to let brokenness be the final chapter. On that beach, as he watched the sun dip low, Daniel finally let himself cry, not out of pain, but gratitude. Not everyone gets a second life. Even fewer get to help others live theirs differently. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Malik, one of the first teens the Phoenix Project had mentored, once homeless, now working on his master's in social work. He'd just been accepted into a leadership program. The message simply read, "Couldn't have done this without you. D. Thank you for seeing something in me before I did." Daniel closed his eyes and smiled. He thought back to the man he was that cold December morning years ago, confused, angry, hollow. He remembered the tattered book, the cheap notebooks, the long nights in the library, the silence of his first rented room. He remembered the ache of loneliness and the thrill of the first small win. How distant that man seemed now, yet how central he still was to the person Daniel had become. Because that man, broken, scared, uncertain, had done the bravest thing imaginable, he kept going. Later that year, a documentary crew asked to follow Daniel for 6 months. The result, Ashes to Ascent, aired on a major streaming platform and ignited a national conversation about second chances. It wasn't a glossy production. It showed Daniel visiting shelters, quietly mentoring new recruits, and waking up at 4 a.m. to answer emails from strangers pouring their hearts out to him. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't save lives with dramatic gestures. He saved them by listening, by showing up, by reminding people that they weren't too far gone, too late, too damaged to matter. A quote he kept on his wall said, "Resilience is less about bouncing back and more about growing through." That became the heart of the Phoenix Project's mission, not just recovery, but growth. Years rolled forward. Daniel aged. His hair grayed at the temples. He traveled less. The Phoenix Project had expanded into 9 countries. Other leaders took up the mantle. People Daniel had once mentored who now carried the message in their own voices. He stepped back from the spotlight and wrote another book, more reflective this time, called The Quiet Climb. It was less about strategy, more about soul. It became his most personal work. In interviews, when asked how he defined success, he never mentioned money or reach or media features. He'd say, "Success is getting back up one more time than you've been knocked down." It's not the applause. It's the quiet moment when you realize you didn't give up, and neither did they. In his 70s, he returned to Chicago, walking through the same neighborhood where he once slept in a shelter. The building was gone now, replaced by a community center, one funded by the Phoenix Project. A mural stretched across its wall, hands lifting one another from a pit of darkness, painted in vibrant reds and golds. Below it, in bold white letters, "From rock bottom to rise." He stood there a long time, unnoticed, just a quiet man in a worn coat watching the next generation walk through doors once closed to him. A girl, maybe 16, passed him and paused. "You Daniel Hayes?" He smiled. "Yeah. My brother went through your program," she said. "He used to be really angry. Now he's mentoring other kids. Just thanks." Daniel nodded. He did the hard work. I just reminded him it was possible. She gave a small wave and disappeared inside. That night, he sat at a cafe, writing in a leather-bound notebook. Not a blog post, not a speech, just a note to himself. Even now, the climb matters. He closed the book and looked out the window at the city that had once broken him. It was the same skyline, but he had changed. Not through luck, not overnight, but through 1,000 choices stacked like bricks, each one laid with trembling hands and quiet determination. Because resilience, he knew, wasn't loud or glamorous. It didn't come with headlines or praise. It was slow. It was stubborn. It was earned. And if his story had proven anything, it was this. You can fall all the way down and still become unstoppable. The years moved forward, quietly, as they always do. Daniel never stopped writing, though his audience had changed. He no longer blogged weekly or posted inspirational quotes. Instead, he wrote letters, handwritten ones, to people in the Phoenix Project who were just beginning their journey. A woman escaping a violent partner. A veteran trying to re-enter civilian life. A teenager who'd been incarcerated since he was 13. He never reused a single letter. Each one was personal, specific, real. He'd start every one the same way. I don't know your exact pain, but I've been close enough to understand. Daniel had discovered something in the later chapters of his life. Success wasn't about becoming someone extraordinary. It was about becoming authentically useful. And usefulness, to him, came from empathy. He didn't speak from a pedestal. He sat in the dirt with you, pointed toward the sky, and said, "You're still capable of rising." One winter evening, back in the city that had given and taken so much from him, Daniel was honored at a civic ceremony. The mayor spoke. A senator gave a speech. There was a video montage and a standing ovation. But Daniel's acceptance speech was short. "I'm not here because I'm remarkable," he said. "I'm here because I didn't stop." Then he stepped aside, giving the stage to a young woman from the Phoenix Project. Her name was Aisha, former foster child, once addicted, now a licensed therapist. She told her story with trembling hands and fire in her voice. Daniel stood to the side and smiled, not at her success, but at her strength. This was the future. These were the voices that would outlast him. In his final years, Daniel lived simply. A small home outside the city, a vegetable garden, a bookshelf that reached the ceiling. People still reached out, some who remembered him from his earliest blog posts, some who only knew his story through others. He answered as many as he could, though more often now, he connected them to the people he had once mentored. The circle was full. His work no longer needed his name on it. That was the goal all along. On his 83rd birthday, surrounded by old friends, former mints, and a dozen people whose lives were linked to his story in ways he couldn't have imagined, someone asked him, "If you could go back, would you change the day everything fell apart?" Daniel sat for a long moment. "No," he said, "I wouldn't change the fall, because the man who lost everything wasn't ready to build what came after. I needed to break to understand how to rebuild with purpose." And that was the truth. What had once felt like a cruel dismantling of everything he was had become the forge that shaped everything he would become. After he passed, a letter was found in his desk drawer. It was never sent, but addressed to the person who thinks they've ruined their life. It read, "You haven't. You're still here. It's not over. It hurts now, but the pain you feel may be clearing the ground for something beautiful to grow. You don't have to climb the whole mountain today. Just stand up. Then take one step. Then another. You'll be surprised how far that can take you." Daniel. That letter was printed and framed in shelters across the country. It was read at recovery meetings, taped to hospital room walls, passed between strangers in support groups. Because Daniel Hayes was never a celebrity, never a guru. He was a man who broke, rebuilt, and then quietly helped thousands do the same. And that is the story of how one man went from rock bottom to unstoppable, not through fortune or fame, but through the relentless, ordinary courage to begin again. Over and over, and over,